week, The American Imperative. Now, I think The American Imperative is the best title I've heard in a decade. And when Dan Runde, my friend from DC, from the Center for Strategic and whatever CSIS stands for, Strategic International Studies, told me they had a new book coming out, and he said The American Imperative is its title. I said, I want that title. I don't even have a book to write it, but I want that title. Dan Runde joins me now with the best titled book ever. Hello, Dan. Good morning to you.
Thanks, Hugh. I'm a first time caller, long time listener. So Wayne told me I'm a poser though because I haven't joined the universe, and I'm going to fix that today. I promise.
Well, I loved The American Imperative, and sadly, it could not be better timed because it arrives in the middle of one of the greatest disasters of my lifetime, the Syria-Turkey earthquake. This is a book about soft power. It's about how America uses AID, USAID, how it uses OECD, all the various international aid. It's about the development community. And I thought, Dan, when I picked it up last week and I started to read it to prepare, that this was going to be an uphill interview. In fact, the backdrop of this enormous humanitarian disaster on a scale, like I say, I've only seen two things close to it, the Sri Lankan tsunami and the Haitian earthquake. It does sort of set the scene for how soft power works. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one of the great things about America is how generous we are as a people. And one of the things I admire about you, Hugh, is that you channel a lot of that generosity through many of your fine sponsors. And I've donated, like I said, because you put forward great sponsors. And I think it speaks to a larger truth. We're a generous country, and it's important both in our private capacities as people of faith or as just as citizens to show up for people when they're in need. And obviously this terrible earthquake in Syria and Turkey requires an enormous response. And the world looks to the United States for leadership in times like these. And so some of it through our private charities, through faith groups and private sector and others, but also at times to the American government through institutions like USAID.
Can we stop there for a second? Can you explain to people, especially the Steelers fans, what you are a 6-year veteran of USAID. You know how it works. What will it be doing right now, and why is it important that it not be absorbed into the State Department?
Thanks. Okay, so I think right away, the U.S. is one of our great strengths is our ability to respond to emergencies. And so the U.S. Agency for International Development was set up in the early 60s to respond to challenges like this. And so they'll put out a specialized team called a DART. Don't ask me what a DART stands for, but it's basically it's medical folks and engineers and others to respond to these sorts of emergencies, to just get a lay of the land, like what the needs are, to do a quick assessment of what's needed. Then the United States will bring in, will send food, they'll send tents for shelters, they'll also find ways to help with the psychological impacts of these sorts of things, because obviously there's terrible trauma after something like this. So we'll respond in a number of different ways, and we'll do so in partnership. We'll work through NGOs, we'll work through multilateral organizations, but the United States will be there. And there's this famous brand called this hand clasp that was set up after the Marshall Plan. There's this famous clasping of hands.
Yep.
And this is known all over the world. And it's the right thing to do for us, but it also at times like this, and this is not to take away from the immediate human emergency. There's also, it's in our interest to be helpful. And at times when there have been things like the tsunami, for example, in the tsunami in 2004, bin Laden had a higher approval rating in Indonesia than the United States did before the tsunami. But because of America's very generous response in the tsunami, the approval rating of bin Laden and al-Qaeda dropped, and the approval rating of the United States rose, and people understood that, the bad guys weren't going to show up for them in a time of need, and the good guys, the United States of America and others, were going to show up for them in a time of need. And so I think in a situation like in Turkey and Syria where we've got, not great relations, being generous is not only the right thing to do, but it's also in our enlightened self-interest to do it as well.
Now, Daniel Runde, you've obviously flunked the lunch rule of saying the American Imperative 7 times. So what you need to say is, as I prove in the American Imperative, and because you've got to say, I want people to, there are case studies involving Burma, Colombia, Indonesia. There's Bangladesh. I didn't know any about the Bangladesh good news story, Daniel Runde, until I read the American Imperative. I do know a lot about China, but I didn't know about these are the Colombia success. It wasn't overnight. It takes 20 years of work to turn a fragile state into above $8,000 per capita GDP, which is the threshold. Do you want to explain that to people?
Yeah, absolutely. This stuff does take a long time. It often's not on the front page of the news. Obviously, this earthquake is on the front page of the news right now, but the kinds of sort of slow successes, whether it's sort of reducing the amount of HIV/AIDS transmission in Africa, or helping turn Colombia around, those are 20-year projects. The Plan Colombia was something started in the Clinton administration, but with both Republicans in both houses of Congress supported. The Bush administration was a really strong supporter of this. So over a long period of time, we put in development money and provided defense money to help the Colombians push back against the FARC and guerrillas, and to help bring peace there, as well as to help create a new set of facts on the ground. Today, if you haven't been to Colombia, it's an amazing place.
Your Medellin story in the American Imperative, which Dan Runde apparently is never going to say, your Medellin story in the American Imperative is eye-opening.
In the American Imperative, exactly. I know, because I am a long-time listener, as you know. I've got to say it 7 times. Is it Frank Luntz said? You got to.
That's the Luntz Law. Yeah.
The Luntz Law, right? So look. So in the American Imperative, I talk about Medellin. There was this mayor who helped turn around the city of Medellin, and so backing positive change agents matters, and we see this in other contexts as well. So look, we're in a period of great power competition with China and Russia. And most of that competition isn't necessarily going to be military. It's going to be competition over vaccines. It's going to be competition over what kind of digital rails of the future. Is the Chinese firm Huawei going to control the digital wires of the future in developing countries? We don't want that. That's not good for our security. It's not good for our commerce. And their values will be implicitly kind of imposed on other countries because of censorship and other things that they're going to do if they've got control of the digital rails of the future. So,
now, Daniel, let me argue with you about one thing. This was the one thing I finished the American Imperative, and I thought, you are the spokesperson for the, quote, development community. A lot of my listeners are damn globalists, blah, blah, blah. And that's not what you're talking about. But you don't like the term the second Cold War with China. I actually think your arguments benefit from the reality of the second Cold War, because Americans are more inclined to go into the long-term development project when the world is understood as in great power competition, as it was in the Soviet Union. We used to do this a lot more willingly when we were up against the Soviets. There was less of a domestic backlash against USAID and all these other things. When there was a Cold War, the tangible benefits of which American aid could be traced to. So I think recognizing, and you spent a lot of time on China, just talking about you behind your back with Ambassador O'Brien, on the demographic problem they have, the debt problem they have, the deceptive business problem, the 3Ds. We are in a Cold War with China, and it makes the case for the American Imperative more necessary, not less.
You know, you're right. I sort of shied away from it, I think, because, just for a variety of reasons. But I think as time has gone on since the book, since I submitted the American Imperative manuscript about a little before a year ago, and my thinking's evolved since the publication of the book. So I take your point. I worry about us. I'd like us to hopefully not getting into a shooting war with the Chinese. I'd like us to find ways to work with them, but they are not our friend. They don't wish us well. And so if it walks like a Cold War and quacks like a Cold War, maybe it's a Cold War.
Now, let me ask you a bigger issue, Dan. There are people there's a foreign policy divide in the Republican Party. And the guy closest to the Trump wing, closest to Dan Runde, is O'Brien. And the guy closest to the non-Trump wing, closest to Trump, is Dan Runde. So is that repair going to happen? I mean, is the Republican Party going to come back to sort of the muscular globalism of Reagan, informed by peace through strength?
God, I hope so, Hugh. I really do, and that's the reason I wrote this book. And I think that because we're in such a big challenge with China, whatever we call it, a second Cold War or something else, great power competition, that we have to be able to have a response. We can't fight something with nothing. China and a little bit Russia have the ability to fill vacuums today. China didn't have that ability 15 years ago. And I talk about it in the American Imperative
At length.
At length. And so we have got to up our game in so many different fields that have nothing to do with the military. And I support the troops. I believe in peace through strength. But I wrote this book to say this is an important dimension of our power. And so I do believe, I think what I found in the Trump administration, when I would engage with them, I told some of the stories in my book, The American Imperative, that if we don't do this, China will fill this space. And are you prepared to allow China to take the leadership in the multilateral system? Are you prepared for China to own the digital rails of the future? Are you prepared for China to provide all the vaccines for COVID? And the answer always was no. We don't want China leading the world. I haven't met a Republican yet that has said to me, and I would ask your listeners, and I'm one of your listeners, I can't imagine any of your listeners calling in and saying, I am prepared to have China rule the world and lead the world. We will not like that world. It's a world of they will reduce our religious freedom. They will reduce our freedom of speech. Rule of law will go out the window. We are not going to like that kind of world. And so we have to take a series of steps in the non-military realm to push back. And when I engaged folks in the Trump administration, some of the Trumpiest Trump people, and if I said to them, are you prepared to let China fill X space? No one ever said to me, yes, I'm prepared to let China fill X space. And so
this is the first great case for soft power that I have read in probably 20 years. I hope you take a carton of books up to Congressman Gallagher's office and make sure every Republican and every Democrat on the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, the Gallagher Committee, gets a copy of this, because soft power got a bad name because it was the only power that Obama believed in. And that's where it got its bad name. I'm wondering, do you agree with me on that Obama ruined soft power by making it the only power?
I grappled with this issue with the title because of this exact issue. I think especially for Republicans, it sounds wimpy. And I believe in peace through strength like you do, and I believe that we need a very strong Navy, we need a strong intelligence community, but we need to have all facets. If we're gonna ultimately win in this great power competition against China and Russia, we need all facets of our power. And so I just think and a lot of our competition with China is not going to be tanks and night vision goggles and ATACMS missiles, which I'm all for all that stuff. What I'm saying is it's going to be these other issues that sometimes don't make the front page of the news. Sometimes
you are, Dan, you are the Clark Kent of the Republican Party, because it's mild-mannered Clark Kent. And Dan is known as being Mr. Ebullient. Come in, come one, come all. Let's talk about what we can do for the poor, the lost, and the least through soft power. But it's actually it's a superpower to have soft power. And the Clark Kents of the world have to get people to listen to this, because you can't do one without the other. We need a lot more hard power than soft power. But, I mean, are you making progress? Or are the isolationists winning?
I think we are winning in the sense that I go back to this argument that, are we prepared to let China lead the world, lead the multilateral system? Are we prepared to let China build all the roads and bridges and the electrical systems? Or are you prepared to let China control the digital rails of the future through Huawei and ZTE? I haven't found any Republican, the most Trumpiest Trump person, and I'm empathetic, to say, oh, I'm good with that. Let them run the world. I haven't yet heard anybody say that yet. And like I said, I challenge your listeners, and I am one of your listeners, and I love listening to your callers, because they're just like me. I bet none of them will call in and say, I'm fine with China leading the world.
And to that end, I want to go to my last question, Dan, and I want everyone to go and get the American Imperative. And Dan will be back on, because he's a good talker. Runde is a good talker. It's RUNDE, by the way, the American Imperative. I want to close by thanking you for defending the Export-Import Bank. For a long and lonely 23 years on this show, I've tried to explain to people why we need the Export-Import Bank. And I've had nothing to give them other than my word, right? I use Airbus. France subsidizes every Airbus airplane sent. Of course, we need XM. But you've made a much more sophisticated argument than I had for XM and for OECD and for USAID. I mean, does anyone in DC, are they having a dinner among the development community to toast Dan Runde for finally making the argument in print?
It's hard being a Republican in that world. And so, like, you'll appreciate this. I'm in, but not of that community. And so, and you know exactly what I mean. And so I think I'm an important voice and I'm a necessary voice. But sometimes, I just think that, look, I think that on the Exim Bank, this is something that it's not 1995 anymore. There are something like 75 export credit agencies in the world. And I'm with John Bolton on this. John Bolton says, look, it's like tying one hand behind her back. It's like disarming economically when all these other folks, whether it's France or anybody else, has got one of these things. And it's about exports for American exports, and it's about supporting American jobs.
So Dan,
yeah.
Really, is there a new community of Dans rising up? This used to be stuff that we believed in. And you wrote about Francis Fukuyama. I'm so glad you did. Because it's like he put a sleeping dart into America. Francis Fukuyama put us all to sleep for 25 years. And now we're waking up and the world has changed and we didn't compete for 25 years on every front, at every level. And you, Dan, I think you've been to some of the worst places in the world, right? You've been to...
It's true.
Where have you been? Like like Clark Kent.
Yeah,
you don't
I've been to Afghanistan. I've been to Iraq. I've been to Liberia. I've been to Haiti. Some really tough places. And so a lot of threats and dangers emanate from these tough governed, these stateless places, these weak, failed states, whatever you want to call them. So not only, your listeners are very generous and they understand that that we're all God's kids and we need to help one another. But beyond that, so the next variant of COVID can come out of some place if everybody's not vaccinated, right? That's one thing to worry about. The second thing is, you've got terrorist groups trained in places like stateless Afghanistan. They have that sort of the Harvard University of Terrorism in Afghanistan because it was a stateless place. So terrorism can reside there.
Or the Northern Triangle, which you write about at length. And I want to finish with this. $8,000 per capita GDP is where a country shifts to not being a problem. Would you explain why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. The magic number is 8,000. I've done 2 studies now on migration. Why do people show up at our border? Well, one of the reasons is that if you've got a weak government, and you got a lot of unemployment, people are going to move. And so when you hit about $8,000 per capita, so think about countries like Costa Rica and Panama. Both are above $8,000 per capita. And even Mexico is above $8,000 per capita. Most of the migration are coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and a little bit from Nicaragua. Well, those folks have about $4,000 per capita or less. If you can get to if you can grow those countries' economies $8,000 per capita, and you have enough jobs, people aren't going to leave. People would rather stay where they grew up. They don't want to leave. It's very disrupting. So that's we used to have, think about European migration. My great-great-grandparents moved because there weren't jobs in Ireland or Germany.
Same deal. They were starving to death in Ireland. Yeah.
So we don't have migration from Germany and Ireland in the same kind of way that we did 150 years ago because these are developed countries. So as countries develop, people stop migrating. That's a long project, but we can help. And if we have a sustained attention to those countries the way we had, for example, in Colombia over a 20-year period and help turn that country around, it's still got some troubles, but it's in a much better place, that we're going to have a lot less migration from the Northern Triangle. That's the ultimate solution to migration is making sure that those countries are rich countries that are buying American goods and services and are partners and can burden share with us on big challenges, whether it's security problems or other things. Colombia is now wealthy enough to, they've hosted 2 million Venezuelan migrants because they're wealthy enough to do it.
Yeah. So that is why, America, go and read The American Imperative. Number one, you'll feel pride in what we have done. And number two, you'll feel urgency in expanding that. It's not much of our budget. It's really nothing compared to what we did in the last 5 years and wasted. The American Imperative by Daniel Runde, who is the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International studies. You know, I never remember what CSIS stands for, but CSIS stands for excellence in everything that it does, including in putting forward people like Dan Runde. Dan, thank you so much. Congratulations. I hope you have a good book tour. Come back and talk some more about the American Imperative with me.
Thanks, Hugh.
Thank you.